This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Wafik Wahba. Dr. Wahba is professor of global Christianity at Tyndale University in Toronto, Canada. His brand new book, Global Christianity and Islam, Exploring History, Politics, and Beliefs, which will be out in February on IVP, explores the complex history of the relationship between Christianity and Islam, how they have shaped the modern world, and their theological similarities and differences. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Wahba, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
My pleasure, Alex, to be with you. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm really excited to talk to you today. The book, as I was telling you before the show, is incredible. It's amazing how much you were able to fit into about 300 or so pages, a lot of content there. But before we start talking about the content of the book, just tell us a little about yourself, your background, and your work.
Sure. I was born in Egypt. I grew up in Egypt, but I immigrated with my family to the States 40 years ago. So I have been living in the United States and Canada for the last 40-something years. I am married to my wonderful wife for 38 years. We have two adult children. One of them is married to a beautiful wife with two grandchildren. As you said, I am the professor of global Christianity at Tyndale University in Toronto. I also pastored churches in Chicago and Toronto for so many years. And I had the privilege of teaching, preaching, participating in conferences globally in over 25 countries worldwide. And I also serve on the board of directors for some Christian organizations.
So what motivated you to write the book, Global Christianity and Islam?
Well, for over 30 years, I have been teaching about this topic, both in North America and also around the globe. And I realized there is a need for a comprehensive book to cover the three areas that I cover in this book, the historical encounter, the politics, and also the theological beliefs. So that was the main motivation. I also, as I preach and lead conferences in different contexts, I also realize that there is a need among church leaders to know about these topics, and they need to be informed in a good way about the comprehensiveness and also the significance of these topics. So these are my main motivation, actually, to write a book like that for scholars as well as for church leaders, for missionaries, for those who are interested in knowing about the complexity of the history of Christian-Muslim relation, theology, how it influenced politics, and all of that.
Well, in my day job, I'm a seventh grade social studies, and in the state of Kentucky, the standards are global Middle Ages. So I cover a lot of content about the relationship between, especially Europe during the Middle Ages, and then the rise of the Arab empires at the beginning of the medieval period. And even going through college and trying to learn about all of the dynamics of that history, it's very overwhelming because so much happened. And even as I'm trying to teach this subject to my kids, it's so difficult to be able to determine, like, okay, what are the absolute essentials, because there's so much there. And as I was telling you before, your book covers a lot of ground. And so one of the questions that I have for you, I know you've been teaching for a really long time, but how did you do the research for a book that is this wide in scope? Because there's just a lot of stuff in there.
Well, it took me 10 years to write the book and another 5 years to edit the book, because what is in this book is technically half of what I wrote. I know it was a very massive manuscript, unmanageable, and obviously nobody will read 700 pages. So I have to do lots of work. I consulted over 5,000 resources during these 10 years of writing. But it is not just the academic research. It is my exposure to the global community in Asia, Africa, Middle East, North America, South America, you name it. And listening to the voices of the people, both Christian and Muslim, their hopes, frustration, desire for peace, for coexistence, all of that. So again, this book is a result of 10 years of work as well as experience in the global context of our world.
Yeah. And I will say, for anyone that's completely unfamiliar with Islam, if you want a great starting point, this book is absolutely it. I really do think you did a great job of
Thank you.
highlighting some of the most critical parts of the history of that, especially as it relates to Christianity in the West more broadly. You also divide the book up into three distinct parts. So the first section of your book deals with the history of the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The middle section deals with modern politics, and the third section deals with faith and belief. And so I want to talk about all three of those today. But before we get into some of the specifics, what was the reason for the three-part division in the book?
Usually you find lots of books covering one of those areas. So you have lots of books covering the history of the relationship, the history of Christianity, the history of Islam. But I find it very important to actually look at the connection that happened during this time. These historical events didn't happen in a vacuum. It didn't happen like Christianity is moving one direction, Islam is moving another direction. In fact, starting from the 7th century, the history of Christianity worldwide is very much tied with the history of Islam, whether we like it or not. This is the reality. It is a historical reality. So we really have to look at it from that perspective. At the same time, I noticed that the religious beliefs are very important, and also how they influence political decisions are very important. So I thought, I thought of writing, actually, my starting point was about comparing religious beliefs. My area is systematic theology and Christian history. So I wanted to write about the basic beliefs. And then I had interest in history. And then I have a degree in political science, actually, and I'm interested also in politics. So I thought probably I should put the three together. They should be three different books. But I think what I want is to offer something new, where the reader can go to one book and actually cover the three areas, because I think they are very much interrelated and you cannot separate them. Obviously, you can choose any part of the book and focus on it. But if you want to have a full, comprehensive overview of Christianity and Islam, encounter history, politics, religion, it is there.
Yes, I completely agree. And like I said before, for someone that's completely uninitiated to the subject, this is a great place to begin. I do want to go through some of this, and I know we have about 45 minutes to break all this down and work through it. And so my hope is that for my audience, because I know that just from talking to some of the people that listen to the show, that there are a lot of people that are just completely in the dark when it comes to Islam. They know nothing about its history, very little about its beliefs. There are a lot of caricatures and kind of misconceptions about how it works. I hope that by the end of this, my audience will have a greater appreciation for the complexities of this history. Your book actually starts, though, before the rise of Islam in the 7th century, with the beginning of Christianity in the first 500 years or so of the Christian movement. Why did you begin there, and what is so foundational about that period in Christian history?
Many things. I wanted to give a background. When Islam appeared in the picture in the 7th century, it did not start in a vacuum. It actually appeared in the context of a large Christian empire, the Byzantine Empire. So I wanted to give a background to this. And in that background, in the first chapter, actually, I talk about the first 300 years, which is so instrumental in shaping our Christian faith. It was characterized with significant theological work in the different schools of thought, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, and so on. And also, it was instrumental in presenting our Christian faith through a statement of faith like the creeds. Actually, this year we are celebrating 1700 of the Nicene creeds, and I can see lots of events and conferences around that. And I mean, this happened in Nicaea is a small city in Turkey today. And then we look to a spiritual movement that started during this time, also the monastic movement that influenced monasticism in Middle East and Europe. Manuscripts were kept in these monasteries, and also nuns and monks did the real Christianization of Europe during the Middle Ages, and their service, medical and education, helped spread the Christian faith around the globe. This was also actually accompanied by a great mission to the world. From the Middle East, from Southern Europe to the rest of the world. But all of this happened in a context of persecution. Christians were severely persecuted by the Roman Empire and pay a heavy price for their faith. In fact, the Christianity increased, And the number of Christians increased significantly in the Roman Empire. By the year 300, there is an estimate of 10% Christians in the Roman Empire, or 6 million from the 60 million at that time. And that's a significant increase. 50 years earlier, Christians only represented 2%. So actually, just a small point here, when Constantine made the decision in 313 to legalize Christianity, it was not really out of the ordinary, because the previous emperor gave some freedom to the Christians. And the idea was, and instead of wasting the time fighting them, let us embrace them and let us embrace the great service and ministry they are doing. They were attending for the poor, for the sick. They cared for everyone. They loved everyone. They preached the gospel of peace. And then by the time we come to Constantine, when Christianity was legalized as an official religion, actually Christian was able to transform the Roman Empire from inside. And this is very, very important to remember. So it was not that Constantine gave the Christianity the power to exist. Actually, Christians already had that power to transform a very powerful empire from within, and then the state kind of recognized the role of the Christian. The second part, after 300, when Christianity became the official religion of the state, Christians start to relax. There's no more persecution, so they start behaving like everybody else. Gone the days where Christians were known for their significant ethical standards and social service and all of that. Come with it also a change in the lifestyle of the leaders of the church, the bishops, the pastors, and all of that. And it automatically, imperial power start to interfere with the church. So in fact, many of these councils, which was very instrumental for the Christian faith, Chalcedon, Nicaea, Ephesus, was initiated by the emperor to make sure that he rules over a united empire. If the Christian faith is becoming the face of the empire, everyone has to believe in the same thing, and he doesn't want a divided empire. So the Christian faith technically served as a unified form in the Roman Empire during this time. Another point, which actually will lead me to why I wrote this, before Constantine, if church leaders disagree on, say, a certain belief or doctrine, the extreme that they can go to is to excommunicate each other. But with the imperial power interfering in the life of the church, the emperor was the one to force a unification. And those who disagree with any outcome of these creeds will be arrested, taken into exile, and their communities will be persecuted. So what happened in the 200, 300 years before Islam, you find people, Christians, in Egypt, in Syria, in Armenia, in other places, being persecuted by the Byzantine Empire, a Christian empire that was supposed to protect them. So they endured persecution from the Romans, from the pagan empire, and later on they endured persecution from the Christian empire that was supposed to protect them. And this is when Islam appeared in the 7th century. These communities were fragmented, they were weakened by fighting. The Byzantine and Persian Empire were also weakened by fighting each other for several decades before Islam. So when the Muslim armies marched through Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, which is Iraq today, they were able to take them very easily. And it is a surprising fact that how the Muslim armies coming from Arabia, that was not really part of the Roman Empire, was not incorporated in any of these civilizations, they were able to take these very powerful nations in a very short period of time, in less than 50 years.
Yeah. And I want to ask you about how that happened. And this is one of the things that I found that a lot of my kids don't understand. People think that they think about the ancient world, the height of it is obviously the glory of Rome. And then there's this long, dark period in between where nothing happened. And that's basically the way that most Americans think about the Middle Ages. But in reality, towards the end of the ancient period, the Western Roman Empire falls in 476, and all the power is transferred over to Constantinople in the East. And so the Byzantine Empire is kind of like the center of what was the old Roman imperial power. And it was the the dominant empire in that part of the world before the arrival of the Arab empires at the beginning of the 7th century. But I often try to explain this to my students. There isn't really, besides maybe the Mongols, a historical parallel for a group of people rising to the heights of power in so short a time as the Arabs did in the 7th century. So I want you to talk about that. How exactly was it that this group of Arabs under the banner of Islam was able to build up to that point like the greatest empire in world history? And how did that kind of antagonism conflict with the Byzantine Empire shape the next several hundred years of history?
Number one reason for such significant advancement in the Middle East was the weakness of the Byzantine Empire. You just mentioned a very significant point that the shift happened in the 5th century when the eastern side of the empire, mainly in the city of Constantinople, that's now Istanbul in Turkey, that became the center of the Christian faith and also the seat of power. But 300 years of division and fighting with the Persian really exhausted the resources. So when the Muslim armies start marching into Syria, Iraq, Egypt, North Africa, they were able to march through all these territories with relative ease. Mind you, many of these communities thought that this is going to be a short, temporary invasion that they were able to overcome. Right. The reality is, Islam is different. This is not just a political power. It is a very powerful religious and political power. And Muslims use a very actually significant techniques. They invited the Christian, who were the majority, of course, of these states, to rule the countries, do the administrative day-to-day life, and they were ruling from the background. So for the average person, they didn't really see the significant change. And the change were introduced gradually over the centuries, where new measures, a new language, Arabic, a new religion was introduced, and so on and so forth. But in the beginning, there wasn't really significant a change. Just to cover the full picture here, by the mid-8th century, Muslim armies took over the whole territory from Spain to Persia. The whole Middle East, North Africa, Spain, and the Persian Empire. This means they took over 2/3 of the world Christianity at that time. They were only stopped at the Battle of Poitiers in France when Charles was able to stop the avalanche of the Muslim armies there, and he, of course, emerged as the savior of Europe during this time. And in light of that, his grandson, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, became the Roman emperor in the year 800, was a measure to secure what is left of Christianity or Christendom at that time, which is basically Europe. But mind you, also, he used force to Christianize parts of Europe, in England and Germany and Austria and northern Italy and so forth. Again, another extreme measure to defend the Christian territory of Europe, because majority of the Byzantine Empire is gone and Muslims are surrounding Europe from every direction. So again, it's a very complex history. It doesn't make sense for a very small group of people that has no history of significant civilization or were not part of any power struggle in the region for centuries. They were not part of the Roman, Greek, Persian, any of these civilizations, Babylonian, Assyrian, Pharaonic. They were by themselves, but all of a sudden they were able to actually take over the whole ancient world except Europe at that time.
Yeah, and that really is going to be, as you say in the book, and as you do a very good job of describing there, this is the framework for kind of how the imperial dynamics work during that period of history. It's the East versus the West, and really throughout much of the Middle Ages, it's the East that's the real center of power. It's within these Arab civilizations where there are all of these technological advancements. They're building on the ideas of ancient Greece and Rome. That's the real hub of power. Of course, the one event that everybody is familiar with is the Crusades, but it's also one of the most caricatured and misunderstood during the Middle Ages as well. And I think there are a lot of people that have very oversimplistic explanations of what happened during the Crusades. And it's an extremely pivotal moment in the relationship between Christianity and Islam. So I want you to talk a little bit about the Crusades, the background, what happened there, and how it shaped subsequent history.
It is a significant and important event. The Crusades happened at the close of the first millennium. So let me put a quick background to that. During this time, the Caliphate, the Islamic Empire, was ruled out of Tunisia and then out of Egypt. The caliphs of this particular Islamic Empire were tolerant to Christians. However, a shift happened with one of those caliphs, and he started persecuting Christians. He dismissed actually the Christians and the Jews from the administrative responsibilities they hold. In fact, up till that point, the Christian and Jews were very, very instrumental for the politics and the economy of the Islamic State, because they were the ones who were running most of the sophisticated administrative business. So that automatically incited persecution for the average person by the average Muslim. Meanwhile, a group of Turks from Central Asia accepted Islam and start moving west with the goal of taking the Byzantine Empire itself, which actually was achieved 4 centuries later when they were able to take Constantinople and establish the Ottoman Empire, the last Islamic empire. They also captured Jerusalem, and they destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the center of the pilgrimage that used to come from Europe every year. So this is the Middle Eastern side of the story. The Western or European side of the story, one of the great things that Europeans used to do during this time is these religious pilgrimages. So they used to do pilgrimage at the tombs of St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome, or St. James, San Diego in Spain. But the most significant pilgrimage was to the Holy Land that was consecrated with the very blood of Christ. Now, the Turks who took over Jerusalem and the Empire State, the Fatimites who was ruling from Egypt, they prevented pilgrimage from entering Jerusalem, and they start harassing and massacring people. So that really ignited the crusade. It was kind of a tipping point. There is you can see a development over the centuries. It did not happen in a vacuum, and actually the concept, the idea of a crusade was boiling in Europe for decades before that. How we defend ourselves. I mean, Europe is surrounded by a very powerful Islamic state from every direction, from the Byzantine side and from Spain. And that created a very unpleasant sense in Europe of insecurity, of fear. And there was that sense that we have to do something about it. So when Pope Urban II issued the first appeal for a crusade, it happened actually in the city of Clermont in southern France, when he called people to go and liberate the Holy Land. I mean, the idea was liberating the Holy Land. The Crusaders did not have actually the ambition to free the whole Middle East. They just focus on the Holy Land. They want to go to the pilgrimage in the Holy Land. So that was the initial thing. For 2 centuries after that, we have unorganized as well as organized crusades that was led by kings, by knights, by nobles. They actually sold their properties. They were so dedicated to go there. The Pope, of course, promised people penance of sin. If they do this, this is going to be a great opportunity for them to repent. And for those who are not interested in spiritual gains, they were also interested in getting a piece of land in the Middle East. So these were the complexity of the dynamic when the crusades started. So, they were bloody crusades. They were costly financially, and they didn't really end achieving the ultimate goal. Yes, the Holy Land was freed for intermittent of time and so forth, but at the end of the day, that was not achieved. But it is very important to look at the take out of that. The whole concept of using force was not new. It started with Constantine. It happened both in the eastern and western side of the empire. But the crusade gave a whole new meaning for using force because the Pope was the one who initiated that. And that happened in a context where the religion and politics was completely fused. So there was no distinction between the Pope's ecclesiastical authority and the Pope's political authority as the guardian of Christendom. So we have to keep that in mind. That was very unusual circumstances. And people were motivated to go for that, to defend their territories, to defend themselves, and also to stop the aggression that was happening around them. So that was the context. And unfortunately, Muslims up till today use the Crusades to speak about the aggression of Christians, but they don't realize what started the crusade. It was the aggression from the other side that started the crusade. And we might argue that the first 2 or 3 crusades was a defensive measures against this aggression. But beyond that, it continued to drag and didn't really achieve anything. The interesting thing that Saladin, the champion who pushed the Europeans out of the Middle East, used the jihad or holy war against the Christians. And the Pope also used holy war against the Muslims. So again, it's an interesting time in history where both Christians and Muslims used the holy war to fight each other. And as I said many times in the book, this is something to learn from. We need to learn from history so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. It was not the best case scenario of communication. I fully understand the aggression and the threat that was happening at this time. But let me conclude by something positive. While the Crusades were taking place, Francis of Assisi, a very significant figure in the Middle Ages, had a different vision. He actually planned several unsuccessful trips to the Middle East, but finally he was able to make it to Egypt. And he met with the Sultan, the ruler of Egypt during this time. And he extended a gospel of peace to him. And in spite, of course, of linguistic and cultural differences, he was able to communicate with the Sultan. And the Sultan accepted him in his court while Louis IX, the king of France, was fighting in northern Egypt. So a very interesting scenario. So you have 2 European, one fighting in northern Egypt and one being accepted by the Sultan. And his attitude of reaching to Muslim with the gospel influenced other people like Ramon Lull, who actually preached the gospel in North Africa and established a monastery in Mallorca to train Christians for mission among Muslims, and actually influenced one of the councils in Florence to adopt Arabic language in the teaching in universities in Europe for the purpose of communicating well with Muslims. So we really need to have a balance. And I love what you say. I mean, what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, there were great things happening during this time. Yeah. In fact, at that same time the Crusades were taking place, a significant movement of that was before the Renaissance. It started in Europe, where major cathedrals like Notre Dame de Paris and other places were actually established. Universities were established at the end of this time. Oxford, Sorbonne, Cambridge, Heidelberg, and they were instrumental actually of initiating and starting the modern age later on. So again, the Crusades was a very low point. Was very unfortunate. The complexity around it has to be understood in the historical and political context of that time, and we need to learn from it so we don't repeat it.
Yes. Well, we have in the 7th century, the center of global power shifting to the east. And then with the 15th and 16th century, with the age of exploration and everything that precedes it, we have the center of global power shifting back to the west for the first time in 800 years. And that's obviously going to change the dynamic of the relationship between Christianity and Islam. So coming into the modern era, how does that power shift affect the way that Christians and Muslims view each other?
A very important point, because by the 15th century, if we move forward now in history, Christians in Spain were able to take over the country back. And the Iberian Peninsula, that includes Spain and Portugal, was now under European kings. And again, the context of that time, most of the trade routes in the ancient world, something like the Silk Road that goes from the Middle East to China, was under the control of Muslims. And in order to use these trade routes to go to India and China, Europeans had to pay heavy taxes. So they start contemplating the idea of how about we bypass these routes and go in a different route in order to reach India and China, because Europe was emerging. There was a significant economic development in Europe that necessitated new resources from India and China at that time, and new trades. So two ideas were contemplated at that time. Again, with the advancement in technology, naval technology, and new awareness of the geography of the world, they thought if we go around Africa, maybe we can reach India. Another idea was contemplated: if we go across the Atlantic in the unknown, maybe we will reach India from the other side. So actually, Vasco da Gama from Portugal took the first route. He went around Africa and was able to reach to India. Christopher Columbus was able to take the higher risk of crossing the Atlantic and going to the New World. And when he arrived in Colombia, he thought he arrived in India. That's why the natives were called the Indians. So anyways, it was a very significant adventure and technically opened to Europe a humongous amount of resources in the New World and in the ancient world that now was under their control. They found Muslim communities across Africa and Asia, and actually they didn't know what to do. They didn't expect that Muslims are all around the world. So that was a surprise to the European at that time, and they didn't do anything to evangelize Muslims, to convert Muslims, or anything like that. But anyways, to just to get to the point here, as we look to this, Europe, for the first time, was able to develop superior military, economic, and political systems that give Europe the ability to control resources beyond the European continent. And the resources that Europe gained from the New World was tremendous, that added actually to the reach of these countries, to first the Spanish, Portuguese, and later on the Dutch, the French, and the British, and so on. But let us remember, while these discoveries were happening, something significant was happening also inside Europe. It is the Reformation movement. After years of university education and debating ideas and the humanists and all of that, the Reformation movement was so significant, not only in reforming the theology and the practice of the church, but also in creating a different social and political movement in Europe. If you can't challenge the authority of the church, you can't actually challenge the authority of the state. And that's what happened with the Reformation movement. And later on, the Reformation movement paved the way to modernity, because now you introduce the concept of thinking for yourself. You have to make sense of what you believe in. You have to do your homework in order to have the right belief. Not everything that you are told is right. You have to find for yourself if it is true or not. So these two movements that were happening in Europe were extremely tremendous in transforming the continent. On the other hand, while all these things were happening, the Islamic empire at that time, the most powerful and the last actual Islamic empire, the Ottomans, that ruled out of Constantinople, which now became Istanbul. By the way, by the time Spain was gained by Europe, the whole Byzantine Empire was lost to the Muslims. So it happened simultaneously in the same century, at the end of the 15th century. So now the Islamic empire start actually expanding inside Europe, taking over most of Eastern Europe. What is today the former Yugoslavia, the Romania, Bulgaria, and actually Vienna was seized twice during Martin Luther's time, which generated tremendous fears in Europe. However, let me conclude by saying this. The quality of social and economic life in the Islamic side of the empire was way less than the development that happened in Europe. So yes, it expanded territorially, the Muslim empire had the largest territorial expansion, as well as the Christian, as they expanded to the New World. But the quality of social and economic and political life was much weaker because they start to go further into conservative ideas, and they were not able to develop as the West, which set the stage for what will happen later on in the 18th and the 19th century.
And that's a really important preface to my next question, because the center of your book is on really the political developments between Christianity and Islam, or I guess spheres of the world that are dominated by Christianity and Islam over the last 120 years. And for anyone that wants to understand that dynamic, the chapter that you have in that book is such a great introduction to all of the really significant events that took place during that time. So talk to us about the last 120 years and how that's kind of shaped the relationship between Christianity and Islam in the modern world, given the fact that, as you said, coming out at the very beginning of the Middle Ages, Islam tended to be a little bit more conservative and against these more like scientific advancements, and the Western world was more open to that.
For sure. Let me start by saying this. It took decades in Europe to come to the modern age. It did not happen in a vacuum. It
Right.
happened after a long time of university education, of debating ideas, of actually persecuting those who present good scientific ideas like Galileo in Italy and so on. So Europe had a long time to develop socially, scientifically, academically, and obviously militarily, and so on. The Muslim world, although was constantly victorious militarily, somehow moved internally into conservatism, which didn't really help developing its social, educational, cultural, and military life. So that's a significant fact of seeing why the two worlds embraced two different trajectories in the 17th and 18th centuries. When we enter into the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, World Wars and all what happened after that, Europe was well into one century of modernity at that time. Very advanced scientifically, very advanced in terms of industrial revolution that came out of the modern age and all of that. But Europe was able to maintain actually a very, one might call polarizing notions. You have a modernity and scientific progress, which actually turn and criticize the Christian faith at that time, religion, but, well, there were only one religion in Europe at that time, is Christianity.
Right.
And while Christianity was severely criticized and up till the liberation theology movement, in fact, at the same time, there was a significant revival movement happening. And out of that revival movement, the awakening movement, also a great mission movement, we call the 19th century the great century of mission, where thousands of European and American went to preach the gospel around the world, and Christianity became a global religion. So if you look to the West, what is it? Is it Christian? Is it modern? Is it secular? It is all the above. Yeah. So Europe was able to actually maintain all these threads together. But that created a very confusing message to the rest of the world. Is Europe Christian? It is Christian. I mean, you look to Europe, I mean, you see the cathedrals, you see the worship, you see Christianity. You look to Europe, you see mission movement, significant mission movement. Missionaries are all over the world. You look to Europe and you see great academic institutions. But you also look to Europe and you see secularization. You look to North America and you see secularized society. The Muslim world didn't go through that. So it was very confusing, very disturbing. And by the 20th century, Muslim countries was trying to catch up with that. And I will come to this point because this is very, very significant. Beginning of the 20th century, most of the European empires collapsed. The Russian, the German, the Austro-Hungarian, they all collapsed. Nation state was built, different political structure was built. French and American Revolution introduced new models of democracy. And the last Islamic empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire. And the whole Middle East Almost every single Islamic land came under Western domination at that time. So when we enter the 20th century, all the Muslim land all over the world, from Morocco to Indonesia, was under one form or another of Western power. And that generated a significant amount of frustration, fear, sometimes admiration to the European model of science and technology, but at the same time, fear. And you don't know what to do with this. So they start embarking in their own models of modernization. And actually, at that time, some Muslim scholars start calling for modernizing the Muslim world. And they also appeal to the Quran, the same way Luther and the reformers appeal to the Bible. They came up, obviously, with different outcomes. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we witnessed significant change in the Muslim world towards secularization, or I would call semi-secularization. Secularization was not fully implemented. Even in the most secularized countries like Turkey or Egypt or Tunisia, still religion played a significant role because there is no distinction between religion and politics in Islam. So by the beginning of the 20th century, we see many of these nationalistic, including Christian and Muslim, who were calling for the independence of their countries, for a nation state similar to that in Europe. By the mid-20th century, most of these Muslim land were able to gain independence from Europe. They built their own nation state, and they continue their programs of semi-secular political orientation and social change. However, they were not able to deliver on the promises they gave in terms of economic and social change. And they start using Islamic rhetorics in order to appease the Islamists while also gaining the support of the masses. By 1970s or 1980s, they start to lose their authority to govern. And they start using dictatorialship, imposing their role in many of these Muslim countries, which actually accelerated their illegitimacy in these countries. So what will happen in this vacuum? The Islamists start to present their agenda as the viable agenda to rule instead of these secular and nationalistic. So these nationalistic or secular leaders, like Ataturk in Turkey, Nasser in Egypt, and Bourguiba in Tunisia, the leaders of Indonesia, they were all nationalistic. They all adopted semi-secular programs. But by the 1970s, 1980s, their countries start moving back to more of a political Islamism, where the political Islamists start to assert their power and they start gain legitimacy in terms of ruling in these countries. It is a struggle that we're seeing right now. It is not over. Yeah. I mean, these countries are still struggling between the two models. Should we continue adopting secular systems? Should we go more Islamist? Again, there is no separation between politics and religion, Islam. So it is something that we observe almost in every country around the world. And we have a great example from Syria right now, where the country is going and what form it will take. Will that embrace an open culture that include everyone, Christians, Druze, Muslim, Shia, Sunni? It's yet to be seen. So again, the 20th century is very, very important in terms of looking at all these dynamics and what happened in the West and how it affects the rest of the world. And I will conclude by a significant point is that Muslim countries did not have the chance to develop their own system in within their traditional system, the way that Europe had the chance to develop their own political and social system over 2 centuries. Muslim world and the rest of the world technically are just catching up with what happened in Europe.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And I do, with the last 15 or 20 minutes left, I do want to talk a little bit about theology and some of the differences, but I do think it's just really important for our audience to understand just how complex the history of Christianity and Islam truly is. There's no straight line between where we're at right now and what happened, 1700 or even beyond that in the past years ago. And so I thought you just did a great job of summarizing that history. And a lot of people are in the dark on that, but a lot of people are just in the dark about fundamental Islamic beliefs. And I remember that when I was in college, probably 2008, 2009, I took a theology class and I had to read a text from another religion. So I picked the Quran and I read the entire Quran, and I realized there's actually a lot of things in there that no one had ever taught me about. And it really did change my perspective on Islam. So I wanted you to give my audience some of the highlights. Now, obviously, the big one is that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are the three major monotheistic religions around the world. And so we all claim to believe in one God. And in your book, you have an entire chapter on the way that Christians conceptualize God and on the way that Muslims conceptualize God. And you look at some of the similarities and differences between those two religions. So break that down for my audience. Give us the kind of overview. How do Muslims understand God, and how does that relate to the way that Christians conceptualize God?
Sure. Well, as you just said, Alex, both Christian and Muslim start from a belief in God. Let me start by explaining one of the most confused things, because the word for God in Arabic is Allah. And sometimes I hear lots of people saying the Muslim God Allah. Well, there's no such thing as the Muslim God Allah. This is simply just the Arabic word for God. So, and let us remember, the Arabic is a Semitic language, so the word Allah is derived from the same roots, exactly like El or Elohim in Hebrew, or Ilah in Syriac or Aramic. So it is simply the word for God. The Al is the in Arabic, and Allah is just simply Ilah. So Christians before and after Islam use the word Allah. All the Bible translation of the scripture also use the word Allah. And up till today, if you go to any Arabic-speaking congregation, they use the word Allah in worship and prayer. So I want to set this straight so there is no confusion about that. It is not a Muslim God. This is not a name of a Muslim God. Now, let us talk about God. Although, the Arabic, Christian, and Muslim around the world use the same word, but they have different comprehension, different experience of how they view God. In Islam, the cornerstone is God's oneness, or tawheed. It comes from the word wahid or ahad, similar to the Hebrew, which means one. And it is a very significant emphasis on the oneness of God against any plurality in God. It is the singularity of God that emphasized in Islam, which is different from how Christians view God. Yes, we believe in one God. This has been the message of the Hebrew prophets. This has been the message of all the Christians and the words of Jesus. And we do believe in one God. We do not believe in three gods. We do not believe in tritheism. We believe in a trinity. So in Islam, God's oneness means singularity, absoluteness. In Christianity, God's oneness is open to the world and can be viewed in relationship, not just absolutism. We also believe that God is absolute, for sure. God is beyond and God is transcendent. But that transcendent God is also relational. We can see, we can touch with our hands, we can hear. And this is the beauty of the incarnation of Christ, that John the apostle would say, we can hear, we can see, we touch with our hand. So this is a major difference between Christianity and Islam. The absoluteness of God, represented in the oneness of God or in the singularity of God, versus the relationality of God that is open to the world. Another significant thing between the two religions, God is unknown in Islam. No one can know God in Islam. You can only detect what God is required from people to do. This is the law that God sent to people, and they have to obey God by obeying the law. The word Islam means to submit to God and to God's law. Well, in Christianity, we know God because we are able to know him through his revelation. Moses can attest to a holy God. Abraham can attest to a relational God, a personal God who spoke to him. Obviously, the ultimate and full revelation of God is in Jesus Christ, where we can see God's love and redemption in full display in the work of Christ. Well, Muslims, for example, constantly use the word Rahman and Rahim, which means God is merciful or God is compassionate. But there is no historical record or event where one can say, yeah, I know out of this that God is merciful or compassionate. So these are descriptive of God, that God is not a bind to, and nobody knows if God is loving or merciful or not. In Christianity, we are sure of his nature because we know his characteristics. So there's a major difference between the two.
That's perfect. Another thing that really surprised me when I was reading through the Quran for the first time was just how much space is given to Jesus. And in fact, the Quran has a very high evaluation of Jesus as a prophet of Allah. And I want you to explain that dynamic to my audience here. How exactly is it that Muslims conceptualize Jesus, and how is that different from the way that we as Christians do?
As you just said, Alex, Jesus is highly honored in Islam. Actually, his name is mentioned all over the Quran. There are lots of stories about Jesus, about his birth, about his ministry, and all of that. The major difference between Christianity and Islam on the person and work of Christ is basically on his nature and functionality. In Christianity, we believe that Jesus incarnate as the Son of God. This is blasphemous in Islam because there is no such thing as God will incarnate and take a human form in Islam. So the core belief that Jesus has a human and divine nature is completely negated in Islam. Jesus remained a human, perfect human person, period. There's no other addition. There is no such thing as a divine nature in Jesus. So that's one major difference. That relates to something more significant. So you have titles, for example, given to Jesus in Islam. Jesus is called the Word of God. He's called the Spirit of God, Al-Masih, like the Messiah. But these are honorary titles given to Jesus in Islam. They bear no functionality. It doesn't describe anything. To the contrary, when the Bible uses words like Logos or Lord or Messiah or the Son of Man or Son of God, these are indicatives of his functionality as the Savior of the world, as the Son of God, and also taking a human nature as the Son of Man. So this is a huge difference. These are not honorary titles. These are titles indicative of his function and work as a Savior. So that brings us to the core issue. In Islam, Jesus remains a prophet of God. The role of a prophet to bring a message to guide people toward the right belief and also to the right practice. In Christianity, Jesus is not simply a prophet. Jesus is a savior. And Jesus incarnate in order to take a human form. He fulfilled a ministry in his life through teaching and preaching and casting out of demons and forgiving sins, and finally dying on a cross and being resurrected victoriously in order to redeem humanity. That's why the Quran completely negates the crucifixion, because there is no such thing as a need for a savior in Islam. And by negating the crucifixion, it has nothing to do with the historical event as such. It has to do with God's justice. God will not allow his prophet to die on a cross, such a humiliating this. Actually, it was the concern. It was Peter's concern. When Jesus said he's going to crucify, Peter said, "Never, Lord. This is unthinkable. You can't do that. We are expecting a victorious Messiah and you're going to die on a cross." It is the same concern in Islam. But in Christianity, we understand that through the cross we have salvation. There is no need for someone to die for our sin in Islam, because simply the whole concept of human nature and sin is different in Islam. These are really significant difference between the Christianity and Islam when it comes to viewing Jesus and his role and his functionality.
Yeah, and you have a couple of other really big issues that you deal with in the book. And honestly, again, I know I've said it several times during the interview. You got to get a copy of the book if you want to understand any of this, because these are really complex. But you deal with the issue of salvation, you deal with the issue of human nature, and then you deal with the issue of community. And you look at some of the overlaps and dissimilarities between the way that Christians and Muslims view all three of those. So just give us the highlights. What are some of the ways that, and again, I really do think the best way to frame it's exactly what you've been doing with the other ones. Explain the Islamic belief and then how Christians' beliefs differ from that, because so many of my audience will be just completely unfamiliar with the Islamic position on those issues.
Thank you. Well, let me put it this way. It's actually, when you look to the concepts of God, who Jesus Christ and his mission, and human nature and sin, they are all one program, and they all tie together. One lead to the other. So from a Christian point of view, we are created in the image of God, imago Dei. Our belief that we are created in the image of God. We have the quality of intellect, of creativity, of feelings, and all of that. We are not gods. This is the concern. In Islam is start to negate any resemblance to God, and we agree with that. But in Islam, humans are created to worship and to obey God. Now, in Christianity, sin is very serious. It affected the relationship between us and God. It permeated to all the human race. It affected the whole structure of relationship with God. And in order to redeem sin, we believe that there has to be a payment, a punishment for sin, and also a justice, and also a love for humanity who are sinners. In Islam, there is no such concept. There is an understanding of sin, but sin is basically mistakes. We are created perfect. We just commit mistakes. And Adam and Eve, when they created mistake out of ignorance, they just apologize to God, say, sorry, we didn't know better than that, and God just forgive them, and end of the story. That it doesn't have any impact on the rest of humanity. So there is no need for a savior. In Christianity, sin is very serious. God is a holy God, and God does not tolerate sin. And sin there has to be a punishment for sin. That's why we see in the cross of Christ, God's justice is served, but also God's love is served. In Islam, God punished sinners for their mistakes, and the maximum they can do is to pray and to practice their religion and fast and do everything possible in order to gain access to paradise. But in Christianity, we know that the price is already paid on the cross, and we can do anything to gain any access to heaven. So this is the major difference. Human nature is different, and also the concept of sin is different, and therefore the solution is different. There is no word like salvation in Islam. It is only about repentance and prayer and working your way to paradise, gaining access as you maximize your chances as much as you can. But in Christianity, the price is paid on the cross, and salvation is guaranteed for those who accept the work of Christ. And based on that, we have guaranteed to have a fellowship with him in heaven, not just being in a place that's full of pleasures. So these are the major differences between the two. God punished sin, not sinners, in Christianity.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, I got one final question for you. It's actually two questions, and I'm going to roll into one here. I think the purpose of your book is to kind of help facilitate conversation between Muslims and Christians. And you want to give Christians the ability to think holistically and responsibly and thoroughly about what Muslims actually believe, and understand the complex dynamics of the history between Christianity and Islam. And as I've said before, I think that if someone was completely uninitiated to Islamic history and beliefs and they picked up your book, I think it would make a lot of sense. You can learn a lot from it. So based on the, I think, desire that you have to want to increase productive dialogue between Muslims and Christians, how do we go about doing that? How do Christians do a better job of communicating with their Muslim neighbors? And then looking into the future, do you see there being an opportunity for there to be more agreement around the world, or maybe not agreement, but for there to be, I guess, more peace and more relationships around the world between Muslims and Christians?
Thank you. This is the ultimate goal of what I'm doing. I mean, the history of Christian-Muslim relation is a very complex and long history. It has lots of layers of experiences. Some are painful, some are promising. So my starting point would be, we need to realize that we don't need to be naive about it, and we don't need to cover it with the typical cliche, we believe in the same thing, we worship the same God, and because this is not true, and it will not take us anywhere. So I think the starting point, we have to be honest about our perception. We have to be honest about what we believe in and what we don't believe in. And there's nothing wrong with that. I can be your friend, but I don't have to agree with everything you say. I can be your friend, I respect you, and I can have peaceful relationship with you, but that doesn't mean that everything you like, every hobby you have, I have to do. So my approach is, we have to be realistic. We see the other through many layers and lenses. So each one's experience anywhere in the world is different. And there is no common Christian or Muslim experience around the globe. This is my starting point. So we see reality, we see religion, we interpret tradition through the lenses, through our experience that we went through. We need to take the others seriously. That would be my major point. We cannot ignore differences. We cannot ignore history. We cannot ignore what happened. But we need to move beyond it and start to work in a better future. We need to acknowledge what happened. We need to see the differences, not to brush it under the rug and say, oh, no, there is no differences. There are differences. But this might contribute to better communication and coexistence rather than fighting. We live in a world that's full of frustration, alienation, confusion. People are looking for hope, are looking for peaceful existence. And religion is supposed to give people hope, not frustration, not violence. So we really have to examine everything here. We have to examine the tradition. We have to examine patterns and look for patterns that work for peace and coexistence rather than violence and attacks. Having said that, there are great examples happening around the world. I mean, with all the tension that's going on around the world, and I'm not going to mention, people can go through any channel around the world and find the tension. But I would like to bring a message of hope. Look across the world, in Africa and Asia and many countries. Christian Muslims sometimes share a meal during the fast of Ramadan. That's a good gesture. Christian Muslims share the same values. They have lots in common when it comes to family system, when it comes to appreciation of the other, of respect, and all of that. So let us uphold on this. When the Bishop of Oran in Algeria was massacred by extremists, actually the majority were Muslims who were in his funeral, and they called him the Bishop of the Muslims. And it was a very high time of tension in Algeria. When the fundamentalists or the extremists burned churches after the revolution in 2012 in Egypt, the government took the initiative to build these churches. Countries in the Gulf, like the United Arab Emirates, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, all these countries are donating lands for building churches. Saudi Arabia is trying to embrace more inclusive cultural context. These are positive signs. And again, I would love to build on that. But my point would be, in the alienated world, in the disillusioned world that we live in, religion can either feed hatred or can be a source of hope and peace. And I really hope and pray that we embrace the second, not the first.
Well, Dr. Wafik Wahba, that's a beautiful way to end this interview. The book is Global Christianity and Islam. I would highly recommend everyone checking it out. I think that it's going to come out on IVP maybe a week or two after this interview is released. Before I let you go, I know that you said that you were not on social media, and I commend you for that. Social media is a cesspool and usually very toxic. So it's really great that you stayed out of that. But just tell my audience where people can find your work and contact you if they have more questions.
Well, as I said in the beginning, I work as a professor of global Christianity at Tyndale University. That's Tyndale. So if you Google tyndale.ca, you will find me, and you can email me. I will be happy to be in touch with you.
Well, Dr. Wahba, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.